Good afternoon, folks. And today we're going to talk about the way things have been for Ohio State and all the other teams that were in the playoffs. Now, Alabama and Georgia, that was literally a major come from behind by Georgia. I'm not saying Alabama's weak by all means, but they pretty much were weak by all means. Now they got to take on Vanderbilt, which should not be a weak by all means. Which they should not have any issues by all means. Now Texas is going to have a bye after their pretty much decisive win over Mississippi State, 35-13. They'll take on Oklahoma as a bye. Now, with that being said, how does that perceive Texas? Oklahoma's a little bit better than what they normally have been. Now, with that being said, Ohio State, Michigan State game, that 38-7 win, they take on a very decent Iowa team. I'm not going to say this is going to be a walk in the park, by all means. Iowa is not a weak team by what anyone can ever say. They can throw the ball, they can run the ball. Their defense is top of the line. I know I said that about Michigan State, and we seem to walk all over Michigan State, but I have a feeling this is going to be a little bit different game. And I predicted a 42-21 game, which I was off quite a bit by Michigan State, which I wasn't off by much by Ohio State. But seriously, I strongly think Iowa will be a decent contender. They might maybe put on maybe a couple touchdowns, maybe. But I seriously think the final score will be like 40. I think the score will be more like either a 28-14 win or maybe a 35-14 win. It's going to be a little bit more distance. But then they travel to Oregon, which will be a very entertaining game. Now, after the 31-14 win over Minnesota, then Minnesota travels to Michigan and takes on a decent Michigan team. And Michigan pulls off the win over Minnesota in the last second. It's like Michigan's a first half team, but they waste all their energy in the first half and pretty much are weak in the second half. That's the issue I have with Michigan. Now, you have Tennessee, who had a bye, will take on Arkansas. And now Georgia will take on Auburn. Oregon now faces off with Michigan State, who just got hammered by Ohio State. Now the question is, what does Michigan State bring to the table against Oregon? They pretty much still stayed right with Oregon for the longest. They stayed with Ohio State there for a little bit there in the first half, but then going into halftime, I can't remember if it was 24-7 or 17-7. Someone's got to refresh my memory, but it was something like that going in at halftime. But then, if my memory works right, 2 touchdowns later, Ohio State pretty much buries Michigan State in the dirt. Now, Oregon, on the other hand, they're ahead 28-3. A pick six, pretty much buries it. Now they're down. Then a field goal later, 28-13. Then 34 Then they score another touchdown, 34-13. So now Michigan State, on the other hand, they're physical. They were a physical defense. Now, I don't know how close to a game UCLA will have, not UCLA, but Oregon will have with Michigan State, but UCLA kept it close there for a long time, but then they just fell apart in the second half. Now, speaking of UCLA, we got Penn State and UCLA. Penn State is going to go out to UCLA. That'll be an entertaining game to see how UCLA and Penn responds to Penn State. They're on a 3-game losing streak after the big win over Hawaii, but I seriously don't think they'll respond well with Penn State. But then again, Illinois held Penn State to only 7 points for the longest time in the first half. So, I seriously think they got it coming. Now Miami, they got California. After their 38-34 scare from Virginia Tech, anything's possible. I mean, at this time, you might as well just take the 8th rank away. I mean, they literally almost got beat by Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech, I mean, come on. Now, I mean, what more can you possibly say about Miami versus California? California, not as well sophisticated as Virginia Tech. I mean, Virginia Tech had Miami on the ropes. Now you have Missouri versus Texas A&M. Missouri had a bye, so they had time to prepare for them. Now it's Michigan taking on Washington. Michigan, who had a 24-3 heading into the fourth quarter, who pretty much will scored a touchdown. Minnesota did. 2 touchdowns. It was 24-17. Then they kicked the field goal, 27-17. And then another touchdown to cut it within 3. 27-24. Unfreaking believable. You had a big 21-point lead going into the fourth quarter, and you nearly blew the game out of the water. You literally blew that game away to a Minnesota team who got blown out of the water by Iowa 31-14. And you literally almost blew the game, and yet you're 10th ranked, and Iowa's not even ranked. How the hell do you do that? How the hell do you do that? You're the 10th ranked team in the freaking nation. And yet you literally almost blew the damn lead like that. Washington, not ranked. They got beat by Rutgers 21-18. Now, if Washington can pull this upset off, because, you know, a lot of frustration's going through their head right now. Washington, literally, I can see the frustration going through their head, so, you know for a fact, this is almost like a national championship rematch, despite the allegations going on right now. Now, if Washington can pull this upset off, it would be a big win for Washington. They've already been back to the drawing board for I don't know how many times. That 21-18 loss over there to Rutgers was pretty much a big devastating loss. Now, if they can pull the better Fanatics off at home and actually beat Michigan, that would be a devastating loss. Now, Wisconsin, USC, who just got done beating Wisconsin 38-21, will take on Minnesota. At Minnesota. At Minnesota, I believe. That's going to be an entertaining game. Because Minnesota literally came with power in the second half against Michigan like no other. If they would have came with that kind of power in the first half, I think we'd be singing a different tune about Michigan right now. Now that onside kick, so-called offside penalty, is still debatable to this day. So that will be one that we'll be talking about for a while. Now, Kentucky and Ole Miss, that was a good game. 20-17, Kentucky over Ole Miss. That was a good game. They take on LSU. They'll have a break and prepare for LSU on the 12th. So, then obviously we just talked about LSU, who just bombarded South Alabama 42-10. They literally had everything go their way. Kentucky was just ready. Kentucky, I feel, is like a team who's been on the dumps for the longest time, and they've literally worked their way back up to where they can literally compete with anybody. They're one of those SEC teams who are literally can compete with anybody. They literally competed right there with Georgia, 13-12. They only lost by a point to Georgia, and they're expected to be destroyed by Georgia. And they stayed right with Georgia the entire time. That tells you a lot about Kentucky, that they are not a team to ignore. Don't ignore Kentucky. That is a team you need to watch for. Now we got Notre Dame. Another team that I still feel is overrated, but somehow. And the Ole Miss, oh, we already discussed that, excuse me. Now you got Notre Dame, who's got a week off to prepare for Stanford, who they demolished Louisville. They didn't really demolish, they only got by Louisville by a touchdown, 31-24. So that's going to be an interesting game. It's just, then they've got to wait for a whole week till on the 12th as well. Now, as a Stanford, they just got hammered by Clemson, 40-14. Speaking of which, the following week, they got to play Florida State, which has been a disaster from the start. They were ranked high. They had high hopes to start the season off, and they've literally just fallen off the cliff. They've been the story of Michigan back in 2008, I believe, when they went 3-9. This team is literally almost like that team. Now, Iowa State, who pretty much demolished Houston and wiped Houston off the map 20-0, they take on Baylor, who is pretty much, had their ups and downs this year. So that'll be an interesting game. And speaking of which, Baylor just got upset by Houston, by BYU, 34-28. They take on Arizona, who just beat Utah. They got a week to wait on them. They beat Utah, upset Utah 23-10 on the 12th. The 12th. Which will be an entertaining game. Now we talk about Utah taking on Arizona State a week later on the 11th. These two teams are literally like questionable. They've had their ups and their downs. Arizona, they got trounced by Kansas. Yet BYU literally demolished. Arizona got trounced by Kansas State. Yet BYU somehow destroys Kansas State, but yet they look like a totally different team when they play Baylor, only winning by 7. Arizona plays like a totally different team when they play Utah. They literally destroyed Utah. They're not the same Arizona you would think they are. Now they got to play Arizona State, the in-state civil war. So that'll be an interesting game on the 11th. Then you got Oklahoma taking on Texas. Well, obviously, that's just going to be a different time. Oklahoma and Texas on the 12th, so that's a bye week for them. Then you have Kansas State taking on Colorado on the 12th. So Kansas State, they got their hands full, but then again, Colorado still, even despite Coach Prime being there, has still yet to prove that he's really worth what they claim he's worth. He's still yet to prove that he's actually that good of a coach. I'm not saying he's a bad coach, but he's yet to really prove that he's well worthy of his position. Now, Boise State, ever since that loss to Oregon, they've actually proven that they deserve to be here. I mean, that was only by a field goal. 37-34. An unranked team at that time. And they literally almost beat Oregon. A touchdown could have easily beaten them. But they decided to kick a field goal and tie to force overtime. They missed. So what's that tell you? 37-34. They take on a weak Utah State team, which they should not have any issues with. Now, Louisville, who just lost to Notre Dame 31-24, has to take on SMU, who pretty much will prove to be hard, but yet not necessarily hard enough. Now, Indiana, who finally faced one of the toughest contenders this year, Maryland, proved to be hard. They played a hard game with Maryland. Now they beat Maryland 42-28, but are still undefeated. The first time since 1967, this might be one of the best teams now since 1967. Now this Indiana team was actually, and I take that back, I think back in 2021, I think is when, or maybe 2019, I can't remember which year. either 2020 or 2019, was when Indiana actually got up to rank 12th. Think of that. Ranked 12th in 2019. They were actually ranked up there. They were ranked 12th for the first time high in the ranks. Right now they're 23rd. So anything is possible at this point. Northwestern, I get it. They keep falling off the ranks because they lose close games. But they keep losing very close games. They don't lose far distant games. They lose pretty close games. As for what I've been hearing. Now, I don't keep track of their scores, so I apologize if I say that incorrectly. So correct me if I'm wrong with that game. But now we'll go on to Illinois, as they lost to Penn State. So they take on Purdue on the 12th. So they got a week to prepare for Purdue. And Purdue, who just lost to Nebraska, which was a very close contest. That's going to be an entertaining game to see how that rolls out. And then you got Fresno State, who plays Syracuse. Actually, not. You got UNLV, who plays Syracuse, who just won 59-14. That's going to be a good game there. I mean, Kyle McCord, since he transferred to Syracuse, he's actually played a pretty damn good games at Syracuse. The former Buckeye has put up some decent numbers at Syracuse, and he hasn't really slowed down at all at Syracuse. He seems like he's pretty much left off where he played right where he left off at Ohio State. Now, Purdue. Now, some of these games are going to be quite entertaining about where you're going to leave off at. Ohio State, I feel like, has what it takes to win some games, but not all of them. They're going to have to step up their game and literally play like they want to win games. Now, with that being said, hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications. With that being said, I'm out of here. Peace.